The flowers were wrong. I stood there in my black dress, the same one I'd worn to my mother's funeral 15 years earlier, the one that still smelled faintly of her perfume despite multiple dry cleanings, staring at the casket arrangements, and something twisted in my stomach like a knife turning in an old wound. White lilies. Dozens of them, their petals pristine and cold as fresh snow, their fragrance thick and cloying in the funeral home's artificially cooled air. Harold hated white lilies. Said they reminded him of hospitals and death, of his father's long decline from cancer when Harold was just 23 years old. "Promise me, Maggie," he'd said after we'd visited his father's grave on our 5th wedding anniversary, his voice rough with old grief. "When my time comes, no white flowers. They're for saying goodbye. I want flowers that remember life." For 43 years I'd brought him yellow roses on every anniversary, every birthday, every apology after our rare fights. Yellow roses because that's what he'd given me on our first date in 1979, when my hair was still the color of autumn leaves and my hands didn't have these liver spots that now trembled as I reached toward the funeral spray. Who orders white lilies for a man who despised them? The funeral director, a thin man with kind eyes and the practiced solemnity of someone who'd shepherded thousands of families through their worst days, was explaining something about the service order, his voice a gentle murmur designed not to intrude on grief. But his words felt like they were coming through water, distorted and distant. My grown daughter Sarah squeezed my shoulder with fingers that felt just like her father's, probably thinking I was overwhelmed by the magnitude of loss. And I was grieving, God knows I was drowning in it, but this feeling was different. This was the kind of unease that creeps up your spine when you walk into your own house and sense someone has been there, moving through your private spaces, touching your things. That's when I saw her. A woman about my age, maybe younger. It's hard to tell these days when everyone gets work done, when 60 can look like 40 and 70 can masquerade as 50, standing near the back of the funeral home like a shadow given form. She wasn't signing the guest book that Sarah had carefully placed by the entrance. Wasn't approaching Harold's casket to pay her respects. Wasn't talking to any of the mourners who'd gathered to celebrate my husband's life. She was just watching. Watching me with eyes that held something I couldn't name. Something that made my chest tight and my breathing shallow. Something that whispered of secrets and sorrows I'd never imagined. She had Harold's nose. No, that wasn't right. Harold had her nose. The same aquiline curve that had given him such a distinguished profile. The same way it crinkled slightly when he was concentrating on a crossword puzzle or trying to fix something around the house. The same way it looked on our son Michael, who was currently greeting mourners by the entrance, completely oblivious to this stranger who shared his features with unsettling precision. 43 years of marriage, and I thought I knew every secret Harold carried in his careful heart. The woman turned suddenly as if she'd felt my stare, and for a moment our eyes met across the flower-scented distance. She went pale, actually pale, the color draining from her face like water from a broken glass, and then she was moving toward the exit with quick, purposeful steps. Something inside me, some instinct I'd buried under decades of being the good wife, the understanding wife, the woman who never questioned and never demanded answers that weren't freely given, made me follow her. My sensible black heels clicked against the funeral home's marble floor, each step echoing in the hushed space like a heartbeat. I should have stayed by Harold's casket, where the yellow roses I'd personally selected that morning created a splash of sunshine against the gleaming mahogany. Should have accepted the condolences and the casseroles and the well-meaning offers to help with arrangements. Should have gone home to the house we'd shared for over 4 decades and figured out how to live without the man who'd been my compass, my anchor, my everything. Instead, I followed a stranger into the parking lot and discovered that the man I'd loved since I was 27 had been living an entirely different life. If this story is already stirring something in your heart, I'd love to know. What time is it where you are right now, and which city or state are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. Let's see how far this story is reaching. My name is Margaret Elizabeth Patterson Garrison, though Harold always called me Maggie from our very first conversation at that church picnic in 1978. I'm 71 years old now, and my hands shake when I pour coffee in the mornings. Not from age, though Lord knows I've got plenty of that, but from what I learned that day in the funeral home parking lot under a sky so blue it seemed to mock the darkness of what was unfolding. People think that when you reach my age you've seen it all. That there's nothing left in this world that can truly shock you, knock you sideways, leave you gasping for air like a fish pulled from familiar waters. We've buried parents and siblings, weathered recessions and recoveries, watched technology change the world beyond recognition. I remember when getting a microwave felt revolutionary, when Sarah got her first cell phone in college and it seemed impossibly futuristic with its tiny flip screen and antenna you had to pull out to get a signal. But standing there in that parking lot with gravel crunching under my sensible black heels, the ones that were already pinching my feet because I'd gained weight since the last funeral I'd attended, since grief had a way of changing everything about your body, even how your shoes fit, I realized that 71 years of living hadn't prepared me for this moment. Nothing could have. The woman had stopped beside a silver Honda Civic. Not new but well-maintained, the kind of car a careful person drives. The kind of car Harold would have approved of. Practical, reliable, unflashy. Cars are transportation, not status symbols, he used to say when neighbors bought flashy SUVs or sports cars that cost more than our annual grocery budget. She was fumbling with her keys, and I could see her hands were shaking worse than mine, trembling like autumn leaves in a winter wind. The afternoon sun caught the silver in her hair. She wore it shorter than I did, in a style that spoke of regular salon visits and careful maintenance. She was dressed well but not expensively, in a navy blue dress that looked like something from Macy's rather than a department store that required appointments. Everything about her spoke of middle-class respectability, of a life lived within careful boundaries. Just like mine. "Excuse me," I called out, my voice carrying that warble it gets when I'm nervous, when I'm about to step off the edge of everything I know and trust. "Excuse me, please." She turned, and up close the resemblance was even more striking. Not just Harold's nose but his deep-set blue eyes, the color of Lake Michigan on a cloudy day, and the way her mouth curved slightly downward even in rest, a trait our children had inherited and I'd always found endearing. Features I'd memorized over 4 decades of marriage, catalogued in thousands of moments both mundane and magical, now reflected in a stranger's face like looking into some impossible mirror. "I'm Margaret," I said, extending my hand the way I'd been taught by my mother back when handshakes meant something, when a firm grip and steady eye contact were the foundations of all human interaction. "I'm Harold's wife." The color drained from her face so quickly I thought she might faint, might collapse right there on the asphalt like a marionette with cut strings. Her keys fell to the gravel with a metallic jingle that seemed too loud in the afternoon quiet, echoing off the surrounding cars like a tiny bell tolling for something that had died without our knowing. "I'm Elena," she whispered, and her voice carried an accent I couldn't quite place. Soft, musical, with rounded vowels that suggested somewhere south of here, somewhere warmer. Pretty. The kind of voice Harold would have noticed, would have found charming. "I'm Harold's." She stopped, closed her eyes, took a breath that seemed to hurt her chest, to cost her something precious. "I'm Harold's wife too." Wife too. Those 2 words rewrote my entire life. 43 years of anniversaries, of inside jokes, of believing I was the only woman who knew that Harold sang Johnny Cash songs in the shower when he thought no one was listening. 43 years of thinking our love story was unique, special, sacred, something that belonged only to us. Wife too. The parking lot tilted slightly, or maybe I did. The world felt unstable suddenly, like everything I'd built my life on had revealed itself to be constructed of sand and wishful thinking. I should have screamed. Should have slapped her, demanded she take back words that couldn't possibly be true. Should have demanded explanations and proof and answers to questions I didn't even know how to ask yet. Instead, I bent down and picked up her keys from the gravel, my movements automatic, polite. Even in the moment my world crumbled, I was still the Southern woman my mother had raised me to be, the one who minds her manners even when her heart was breaking. "Would you like to get some coffee?" I heard myself ask, my voice strangely calm. "I think we need to talk." Harold and I met at a church picnic in 1978, one of those perfect September afternoons when the air smells like apples and possibility. I was 26, working as a secretary at the county courthouse, living with 2 roommates in an apartment that smelled perpetually of cat litter and dreams deferred. The kind of place young women ended up when they'd moved to the city with grand plans that hadn't quite materialized, when they were still figuring out who they wanted to become. I wore a yellow sundress that day, one I'd sewn myself from a butterick pattern, because buying clothes off the rack was still a luxury I couldn't afford, and I'd spent an hour that morning working my hair into soft curls that I hoped looked effortless. The church had set up long tables in the fellowship hall, covered with checkered tablecloths and laden with enough casseroles and sheet cakes to feed half the county. Harold was 28, recently hired as a regional sales manager for an agricultural equipment company, with kind eyes the color of summer storms and a laugh that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. He'd moved to town just 6 months earlier, transferred from the company's headquarters in Oklahoma, and he was still learning everyone's names, still finding his place in our small community's intricate social web. He asked me to dance to The Way You Look Tonight playing from someone's boombox, a song that would become our song over the decades that followed. When he spun me around, my yellow sundress flared out like a flower opening to the sun, and I felt beautiful. More than beautiful. I felt chosen, selected from among all the women at that picnic for reasons I couldn't fathom but didn't question. "You have the prettiest smile I've ever seen," he told me as we swayed to the music, his voice low enough that only I could hear. "It lights up your whole face." Our courtship was sweet and proper, the kind of romance my grandmother would have approved of. He'd pick me up for dates in his burgundy Buick. Always 5 minutes early, always with the radio tuned to the soft rock station I'd mentioned liking. He opened doors, walked on the traffic side of sidewalks. Always had me home by 10 on weeknights because I had to work the next morning. We went to movies at the old Paramount Theater downtown, sharing buckets of popcorn and holding hands in the dark like teenagers. We attended church services together, sitting in the third pew on the right side where his voice would blend with mine during hymns. We took long drives through the countryside, windows down, talking about everything and nothing. His dreams of advancement in the company, my secret hope of maybe going back to school someday, the children we both wanted, the house we'd like to buy. He met my parents on our 4th date, arriving with flowers for my mother and a bottle of good bourbon for my father. He charmed my mother by remembering she preferred tea to coffee and asking thoughtful questions about her rose garden. He won over my father. No easy task. By discussing crop yields and weather patterns with the kind of knowledge that came from actually caring about the farmers who bought his company's equipment. "That young man has good sense," my father declared after Harold left that evening. "And he looks at you like you hung the moon." "Such a good man," everyone said when our engagement was announced 6 months later. "Such a catch. Margaret landed herself a real prize." We married in June 1979, in the same Methodist church where we'd met, where Harold had charmed the congregation with his willingness to help with everything from setting up chairs to organizing the church's annual charity drive. I wore my grandmother's pearl necklace, the one that had belonged to her grandmother before that, and carried yellow roses from Harold's carefully tended garden. Harold cried when I walked down the aisle, tears streaming down his face without shame or embarrassment. I remember thinking that any man who wasn't ashamed to cry in front of a church full of people was someone I could trust with my whole heart, my entire future, all the secret dreams I'd never spoken aloud. We honeymooned in Gatlinburg, staying in a cabin that overlooked the mountains with a fireplace and a hot tub and windows that framed the Smoky Mountains like living postcards. Harold had booked it months in advance, planned every detail from the champagne waiting in our room to the dinner reservations at restaurants I'd only read about in magazines. He was always good at planning, at thinking ahead, at anticipating needs before they arose. I should have recognized that trait for what it really was. Not romantic spontaneity but careful orchestration, the kind of meticulous attention to detail that comes from managing multiple complex situations simultaneously. Our early years were everything I'd dreamed of during those lonely nights in my shared apartment. We bought a house on Maple Street with a front porch wide enough for 2 rocking chairs and enough bedrooms for the children we planned to have. 3 bedrooms upstairs, a nursery we painted pale yellow because we wanted to be surprised, and a master bedroom where Harold would hold me close on winter nights and tell me about his day on the road. Harold traveled for work, sometimes 2 weeks out of every month, crisscrossing the Midwest in his company car, visiting farms and equipment dealers, building the relationships that would eventually make him one of the company's most successful salesmen. That was normal in sales, everyone said. Expected. The price you paid for a good living, for the security that came with a steady paycheck and benefits that covered doctor visits and dental cleanings. I kept house during those absences, tended my garden, joined the ladies' auxiliary at church, and waited for him to come home with stories from the road. He'd call every evening from whatever motel he was staying in, his voice crackling through long-distance static as he told me about the farmers he'd met, the deals he'd closed, how much he missed sleeping in his own bed. "I love you, Maggie," he'd say before hanging up. "Dream about me tonight." And I did dream about him, about the life we were building together, about the future that stretched ahead of us like a golden road. Sarah was born in 1982, after 3 years of trying and one heartbreaking miscarriage that left me believing God was punishing me for some sin I couldn't name. I'd spent months blaming myself, wondering what I'd done wrong, why God would give us the gift of new life only to take it away before we could even hold our baby. "It's not your fault," Harold had whispered the night we lost our first pregnancy, holding me while I sobbed into his chest. "Sometimes these things just happen. We'll try again when you're ready." When Sarah finally arrived, 8 pounds 2 ounces of squalling red-faced perfection, Harold was right there beside me, coaching me through contractions, cutting the umbilical cord with hands that shook with excitement and awe. He'd driven 3 hours straight from a sales call in Missouri, arriving at the hospital still wearing his work clothes, refusing to leave my side even when the doctors suggested he might want to get some rest. "I'm not missing this," he'd said firmly. "This is the most important day of my life." Michael followed in 1985, and our family felt complete. Harold was a wonderful father, patient, involved, always home for school plays and soccer games despite his demanding travel schedule. He'd schedule his trips around important events, move meetings to make sure he was there for birthday parties and Christmas mornings and first days of school. "He makes time for what matters," I used to tell other wives who complained about their husbands' work demands. "That's the mark of a good man, knowing what truly counts." But looking back now with the terrible clarity that comes from knowing the truth, I can see the signs I missed. Or chose not to see. The way he'd sometimes get mysterious phone calls and step outside to take them, claiming they were work emergencies that couldn't wait until morning. How he'd grown increasingly particular about doing his own laundry, especially after business trips, saying he didn't want to burden me with clothes that might be stained with farm dust or equipment grease. The gifts he'd sometimes bring home, perfume that wasn't quite my scent, a scarf in colors I never wore, jewelry that was beautiful but not quite my style, that he'd claim he'd thought I might like to try something new. "You always wear the same things," he'd say with a smile when I'd politely thank him for yet another gift that felt chosen for someone else. "I thought maybe you'd like to experiment a little." There were times when he'd mention cities he'd visited, restaurants he'd tried, and the details would be too vivid, too personal for business dinners. He described the way the light fell through the windows at a cafe in Kansas City, or how a particular hotel had the softest towels he'd ever felt, or how a jazz club in St. Louis reminded him of something from a movie. "You notice everything," I'd say, charmed by his attention to detail. "Most men wouldn't remember things like that. But when you love someone, you explain away the inconsistencies. You tell yourself that your husband is just more observant than most men, more interested in the world around him, more romantic in his appreciation of beauty and atmosphere." The children grew up thinking their father was a hero. He coached Michael's little league team whenever he was in town, teaching our son how to field ground balls and swing for the fences. He never missed one of Sarah's piano recitals, sitting in the front row with a camera and a proud smile, applauding louder than anyone else in the room. He built a tree house in our backyard that was the envy of the neighborhood, complete with a working pulley system for hoisting up snacks and toys, a rope ladder that made Michael feel like a pirate, and windows with real glass that Sarah used for playing house with her dolls. "Daddy makes everything an adventure," Sarah used to say, and I'd glow with pride at having chosen such a wonderful man to father my children. When the kids left for college, Sarah to study nursing at the state university, Michael to pursue engineering at a school 3 states away, Harold and I entered that phase of marriage that either destroys couples or deepens them. We deepened. Or so I thought. We took up ballroom dancing at the community center, learning the waltz and foxtrot and tango from an elderly instructor who'd once danced professionally. Harold was surprisingly graceful for such a tall man, leading me across the floor with confidence and grace. We traveled to places we'd always wanted to see. Ireland, where we kissed the Blarney Stone and stayed in bed and breakfasts that served tea with actual china cups. New England in the fall, driving winding roads through forests painted in impossible shades of red and gold. A cruise through the Caribbean where Harold surprised me by arranging for yellow roses to be delivered to our cabin every morning, just like our early courtship. "I want to make up for all the time I was traveling," he said. "All those evenings when you were alone while I was on the road." He retired at 65 earlier than planned, claiming he wanted to spend his golden years with me instead of living in hotel rooms and rental cars. We started talking about downsizing, maybe moving to a retirement community near the coast where we could watch sunsets and grow old together. Finally, I thought as we toured assisted living facilities and planned our simplified future. Finally, I have him all to myself. But retirement didn't suit Harold as well as I'd expected. He seemed restless those first few months, pacing the house like a caged animal, starting projects he never finished, taking up hobbies he'd abandon after a few weeks. 40 years of structure and travel, then suddenly nothing but time stretching ahead, I told our neighbor Mrs. Henderson when she asked how Harold was adjusting. It's a big change for a man who's always been so busy. He started taking longer drives, claiming he needed to clear his head and figure out what comes next. Sometimes he'd be gone all day, returning with stories about country roads he'd discovered or historical markers he'd stopped to read. "I'm just exploring," he'd say when I'd ask about his day. "Seeing what's out here that I missed during all those years of rushing from one appointment to the next." I never questioned it. Why would I? Harold had never lied to me about anything important. Or so I believed. The heart attack took him quickly, which the doctor said was a blessing. He was in the garden, pruning the rose bushes he'd planted for our 25th anniversary, when his heart simply stopped. Sarah found him there when she came for our weekly Sunday dinner, surrounded by the yellow roses he'd grown for me for over 2 decades. At least he didn't suffer, everyone said at the time. At least it was peaceful. But standing in that funeral home parking lot, looking into Elena's face, Harold's face reflected in feminine features, I realized that Harold had been suffering. We all had. We just hadn't known it yet. The coffee shop Elena chose was 20 minutes away from the funeral home, in a part of town I rarely visited. A small place called Rosie's, with mismatched chairs and the kind of worn linoleum floors that spoke of decades of spilled conversations and broken hearts. The walls were decorated with old photographs of the town's founding families, faces long dead staring down at us with the solemn dignity of people who'd never imagined a world where love could be this complicated. We sat across from each other in a corner booth with cracked red vinyl seats that had probably witnessed 1,000 difficult conversations, 2 women who should have been strangers but shared the most intimate connection possible. We'd both slept beside the same man, loved him, trusted him with our futures, built our entire adult lives around the solid foundation of his presence. Elena ordered black coffee in a voice barely above a whisper. I asked for tea with honey, my hands still shaking too badly to trust myself with hot liquid in a delicate cup. The waitress, a tired-looking woman with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, sensed the gravity of our meeting and gave us privacy after delivering our drinks, retreating to the counter where she busied herself with unnecessary tasks. The silence stretched between us like a chasm, filled with questions neither of us knew how to ask. I studied Elena's face, cataloging the ways she resembled Harold, searching for clues about who she was, how long she'd been part of his life, how I'd never known she existed. She was pretty in an understated way, with the kind of natural beauty that improves with age rather than fighting it. Her makeup was subtle, expertly applied, not the heavy-handed attempt to recapture youth that so many women our age fell into, but the confident enhancement of someone comfortable in her own skin. Her clothes were well made but not expensive, classic styles that suggested good taste and careful budgeting. Everything about her spoke of respectability, of a life lived within careful boundaries. Just like mine. How long? I asked finally, because it was the only question that mattered in that moment, the foundation upon which all other questions would be built. Elena stared into her coffee cup as if it might contain answers to impossible questions. When she spoke, her voice was steady but soft, carrying that musical accent I still couldn't identify. 38 years. The number hit me like a physical blow, stealing my breath and making my vision blur at the edges. 38 years. That meant Harold had been married to both of us for almost the entire duration of my marriage. That meant while I was walking down the aisle in my grandmother's pearl necklace, while I was giving birth to our children, while I was celebrating anniversaries and building a life based on what I thought was exclusive love, he was doing the same thing with someone else. Everything I thought I knew was a lie. My teacup rattled against its saucer when I tried to lift it, the sound sharp and jarring in the quiet cafe. Elena looked up then, and I saw my own devastation reflected in her eyes. The same confusion, the same sense that the ground had shifted beneath our feet and left us grasping for something solid to hold on to. "He told me you were dead," Elena said quietly, her words falling between us like stones into still water. "A car accident," he said. "Long before we met. He said he'd never love anyone the way he loved his first wife. but that life had to go on. I laughed, a bitter sound that surprised us both, sharp and ugly in the peaceful atmosphere of the cafe. Several other customers glanced our way, concern flickering across their faces before they politely returned to their own conversations. He told me he'd never been married before, I said, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. Said he'd been waiting his whole life for the right woman. That I was his first and only love. Elena's face crumpled slightly and I realized we were both victims of the same lie, just told from different angles. Harold hadn't chosen one of us over the other. He'd chosen to have both of us, to build two complete lives that never intersected until this moment. Where did you think he was when he traveled? Elena asked, leaning forward slightly, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup like it was an anchor in rough seas. Work, I said, the word tasting like ash in my mouth. Agricultural equipment sales. 2 weeks out of every month, sometimes more during busy seasons. He had territories all over the Midwest. Elena nodded slowly, understanding dawning in her eyes. He told me he was a long-haul trucker. Said the job kept him on the road constantly, but it was good money for our future. For our retirement. Our future. She'd had a future with him too. Dreams and plans and shared hopes that Harold had nurtured with the same careful attention he'd given mine. Retirement plans and bucket lists and promises about growing old together. Do you have children? I asked, though I dreaded the answer, dreaded learning how deep Harold's deception ran. Elena nodded, tears beginning to spill down her cheeks. 2. Miguel is 36 now, works as a teacher in Dallas. Carmen is 33, she's a nurse here in town, works at the same hospital where... She stopped, covering her mouth with her hand as if she'd almost revealed something she shouldn't have. Where what? I pressed gently. Where Sarah works, Elena whispered. I've seen your daughter dozens of times over the years. In the cafeteria, in the hallways. Carmen always said there was another nurse who looked exactly like her, could have been her sister. We used to joke about it. Of course. Of course our daughters worked at the same hospital, passed each other in hallways, perhaps even worked the same shifts without ever knowing they shared a father. The coincidences were too perfect, too cruel to be random. I did the math quickly, my mind reeling with the implications. Elena's children were born just 3 and 5 years after mine. Harold had been juggling 2 families, 2 sets of birthdays and school plays and sleepless nights with sick babies, 2 sets of college tuition and wedding planning and grandchildren he'd never met. How did he manage it? I whispered, more to myself than to Elena. How did he keep track of all the lies? All the details? The schedules and anniversaries and everything? Elena reached into her purse and pulled out a small leather-bound planner, the kind Harold had always carried. She opened it to reveal pages covered in Harold's familiar handwriting. Appointments, phone numbers, reminders written in his careful script. He left this in my car last month, she said. I was going to return it to him, but then... She gestured helplessly. I found it after the funeral home called. I took the planner with trembling hands, recognizing Harold's organizational system immediately. But as I flipped through the pages, I realized this wasn't the calendar I was familiar with. The appointments were different, the names unfamiliar. Doctor's visits for Elena, parent-teacher conferences for children I'd never heard of, anniversary reminders for dates that meant nothing to me. He'd kept separate calendars. Separate lives. Organized with the same meticulous attention to detail he'd always applied to everything. He was very organized, Elena said, and there was something almost admirable in her voice. Always kept detailed records, wrote everything down. I thought it was because of his work, all the deliveries and routes he had to remember. I thought of Harold's home office, the filing cabinets I'd never been allowed to touch. Business records, he'd always said when I'd offered to help organize them. Too complicated and some of it confidential company information. Of course it was confidential. Half his life was confidential. The children, I said, struggling to process the implications that kept expanding like ripples in water. Your children and my children. They're half-siblings, Elena finished, her voice breaking on the words. Miguel and Carmen don't know yet. I haven't told them about today about you. I don't know how to explain that their father had another family. Half-siblings. Sarah and Michael had a brother and sister they'd never met, never even knew existed. There had been birthday parties and graduations and holidays happening parallel to our own, starring people who shared their father's blood, their father's love, their father's attention. Did he ever seem guilty? I asked, desperate to understand how a man could live such an elaborate lie without it destroying him. Conflicted? I mean, how do you live that kind of double life without it eating you alive? Elena considered this, stirring her coffee even though she'd added nothing to it. Sometimes he would get very quiet, especially around holidays. He'd hold me a little tighter, tell me how much he loved me, how grateful he was for our life together. But then he'd also get these phone calls that would make him sad. Emergency calls from work, he said, but they always seemed to upset him more than business problems should. I remembered those same moments. Harold pulling me close after returning from trips, his voice thick with emotion as he whispered about how lucky he was to have me. I'd always been touched by his sentimentality, never imagining it might have been guilt disguised as love. Those phone calls, I said slowly. He got them at our house too. Always stepped outside to take them, saying they were work emergencies. Elena's eyes widened. Do you think we were calling each other? Without knowing. Gut. The thought was staggering. How many times had I called Harold while he was with Elena, forcing him to lie to her about why he couldn't talk? How many times had she done the same to me? We'd been unwitting participants in each other's deception. The money, I said suddenly, another piece of the puzzle clicking into place. He made good money, but we never seemed to have as much as we should have. I always thought it was because of his equipment and travel expenses, but he was supporting 2 households, Elena said simply. 2 mortgages, 2 sets of children's college funds, 2 lives' worth of expenses. The scope of his deception was staggering. It wasn't just the emotional betrayal, it was the financial sacrifice he'd made to maintain both families. No wonder he's worked so hard, traveled so much, never seemed to fully relax even when he was home. He'd been carrying the weight of 2 complete lives. How exhausting it must have been, I thought, and then immediately felt angry at myself for feeling sympathy for him. Did you ever suspect? Elena asked, her voice gentle but probing. I wanted to say no, to claim that Harold had been such a perfect actor that there had been no signs. But that would have been another lie added to the foundation of lies our lives had been built on. Little things, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Phone calls he'd take outside. The way he'd sometimes seem distracted when he came home, like his mind was somewhere else entirely. There were times when he'd mention details about places he'd been that seemed too personal for business trips, like he'd been there with someone who mattered to him. I paused, remembering something that had always puzzled me. He gave me a necklace for our 20th anniversary. It was beautiful, but when I tried to get it appraised for insurance, the jeweler said it was vintage, probably from the 1960s. When I asked Harold about it, he said he'd bought it at an estate sale, and thought it suited me better than something new. Elena's face went pale. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small velvet box. With shaking hands, she opened it to reveal a necklace I recognized immediately. My grandmother's pearls, the ones that had gone missing from my jewelry box about 15 years ago. He stole from me to give to her. He said they belonged to his grandmother, Elena whispered. Said he'd been saving them for the right moment, the right woman. The betrayal cut deeper than I'd thought possible. It wasn't just that he'd had another wife. It was that he'd taken pieces of my family's history, my legacy, and woven them into his lies. He'd stolen my grandmother's pearls and created a false history for them, making Elena believe she was receiving a family heirloom when she was actually receiving stolen property. I'm so sorry, Elena said, starting to extend the box toward me. I had no idea. I would never have. Keep them, I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. You've worn them longer than I ever did. Besides, what would I tell Sarah? How would I explain where they've been all these years? Elena closed the box and slipped it back into her purse, but I could see the guilt and confusion in her eyes. We were both victims here, both casualties of Harold's inability to choose between the lives he'd built. We sat in silence for a moment, 2 women bound together by betrayal and loss. Around us, the coffee shop hummed with normal conversations, people discussing work schedules and weekend plans and ordinary problems that seemed impossibly simple compared to what we were facing. There's something else, Elena said finally, her voice so quiet I had to lean forward to hear her. Something I haven't told you. My stomach clenched. What else could there be? How much deeper could this deception run? Carmen looks just like your daughter, Elena continued. I saw her at the funeral home today, talking to the funeral director about the service arrangements. For a moment I thought it was my Carmen, but then I realized it had to be Sarah. They could be twins if not for the age difference. Of course they could. Harold's genetics had been strong in both families. Sarah had always been the image of her father, and apparently so was her half-sister. Two women who shared the same features, the same mannerisms, the same father they'd never known was shared. Carmen's getting married next month, Elena continued, tears streaming down her face now. She's been planning this wedding for over a year, and Harold was supposed to walk her down the aisle. She's devastated by his death, but she doesn't know. She doesn't know about you, about your family. I thought of Sarah, who'd had her own wedding 5 years earlier. Harold had beamed with pride as he walked her down the aisle, tears streaming down his face as he placed her hand in her husband's. I'd thought those tears were pure joy, pure love for his daughter. Now I wondered if they'd been tears of guilt, knowing he'd have to do it all again for another daughter in another life. Knowing he was living a moment that should have been unique and special while planning to recreate it with another child he loved just as much. What are we going to do? I asked the question that had been building in my chest since the moment Elena told me she was Harold's wife too. How do we move forward from this? How do we tell our children? How do we handle the legal issues, the inheritance, everything? How do we handle everything when our entire lives have been revealed to be built on lies? Elena shook her head helplessly. I keep thinking I should wake up and find out this is all a nightmare. That Harold will walk through the door with some explanation that makes sense, that puts our world back together. But Harold was never going to walk through any door again. Harold was lying in a casket surrounded by white lilies he would have hated, taking his secrets with him to the grave. Did he love us both? I asked, the question scraping my throat raw. Or was one of us just convenient? A lie he maintained out of habit or obligation. Elena reached across the table and touched my hand. Her fingers were soft, well cared for, and I noticed she was wearing the same shade of nail polish I favored, a soft pink called ballet slipper. Of course he'd noticed the same details about both of us, encouraged the same choices, shaped both of our lives in the same subtle ways. I think he loved us both, she said quietly, her voice filled with a sadness that seemed too deep for tears. I think that's what makes this so terrible. If one of us had been just a lie, an affair, it would be easier to understand. But this was love. Complicated, selfish, impossible love. He was right. The evidence was everywhere, in the decades of commitment, in the children he'd raised, in the care he'd taken to protect both families from the truth. Harold hadn't been a man who'd gotten trapped in a lie. He'd been a man who'd chosen to live two lives because he couldn't bear to give up either one. But love built on lies isn't really love at all. Is it? The funeral, I said suddenly, realizing we hadn't addressed the immediate crisis. Tomorrow. How do we handle tomorrow? Elena's face crumpled, and I saw in her expression the same desperate grief I'd been carrying since Harold's death. She was mourning him just as deeply as I was, with the same sense of loss and devastation. I don't know, she whispered. I want to say goodbye to him, to be there when we lay him to rest. But how can I? Your family will be there, your friends, everyone who knew you as Harold's wife. I can't just show up and claim my place beside you. No, she couldn't. There was no protocol for this situation, no etiquette guide for sharing grief with the other woman who turned out to be another wife. Society had no framework for what we were facing. Maybe, I said slowly, an idea beginning to form in my mind, maybe we figure this out together. Maybe we will find a way to honor what was real about both of our marriages, even if the foundation was built on lies. Elena looked at me with something that might have been hope, the first positive emotion I'd seen across her face since we'd started this impossible conversation. You would do that? After everything he put us through, after all the lies, you'd let me be part of saying goodbye? What's the alternative? I asked, and I realized I was no longer just asking her. I was asking myself, the universe, the God I'd prayed to every Sunday for 43 years without ever imagining I'd need guidance for something like this. We both loved him. We both lost him. Our children both lost their father. Letting anger destroy what's left won't bring him back or undo the lies. But it might give us a way forward. As we left Rosie's coffee shop that evening, exchanging phone numbers like old friends reuniting instead of two women whose entire lives had just imploded, I realized that Harold's death had given birth to something he'd never intended to create. A relationship between the two women he'd loved enough to lie for. If only he could see us now, I thought as I watched Elena drive away in her practical Honda Civic. Maybe he'd finally understand that the truth, however painful, is always better than the most beautiful lie. But as I drove home to the house Harold and I had shared for over 4 decades, passing familiar landmarks that now seemed foreign in light of what I'd learned, I knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new revelations, new ways for the dead to continue breaking the hearts of the living. The house felt different when I walked through the front door, like a stage set for a play I'd been unknowingly performing for decades. Every photograph on the mantel, every piece of furniture we'd chosen together, every corner where we'd shared quiet moments, all of it felt contaminated by the knowledge that Harold's heart had been divided, that his attention had been split, that his love had been shared in ways I'd never imagined. I sat in Harold's chair that night, surrounded by the detritus of a life I'd thought I understood, and tried to reconcile the man I'd loved with the man who'd been capable of such elaborate deception. Tomorrow I would have to face our friends, our family, our community, and pretend that nothing had changed while everything had changed completely. Tomorrow I would have to bury a stranger wearing my husband's face. The funeral was scheduled for 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning that dawned gray and humid, with the kind of oppressive heat that makes everything feel heavier than it should. I woke at dawn after a night spent tossing between restless sleep and wakefulness, my body aching from the tension I'd been carrying since my conversation with Elena, my mind circling the same impossible questions like water swirling down a drain. How do you bury a man you thought you knew? How do you mourn someone who was living a lie? How do you say goodbye when you're not sure who you're really saying goodbye to? I dressed carefully in my black dress, the one that had become my uniform for farewells, and sat at my vanity to apply makeup with hands that still trembled when I thought too hard about what I'd learned. In the mirror I looked every one of my 71 years and then some. The stress of the last 48 hours had etched new lines around my eyes, carved deeper shadows beneath them, pulled down the corners of my mouth in ways that made me look like a stranger to myself. This is what betrayal looks like, I thought, studying my reflection with clinical detachment. This is what learning the truth does to a woman's face. Elena and I had spoken twice since our coffee shop revelation, brief conversations where we tried to figure out how to navigate the funeral without causing a scene or raising questions we weren't ready to answer. We'd agreed that she would attend quietly, sitting in the back, and that after the service, after the burial, I would introduce her to Sarah and Michael as someone your father knew from work. It wasn't the truth, but it was a bridge toward truth, something we could all walk across when we were ready. If we were ever ready. Sarah arrived early to drive me to the church, her eyes red-rimmed from crying, her face bearing the kind of exhaustion that comes from grief so deep it disrupts sleep, appetite, the basic functions of daily life. She hugged me tightly when she saw me, and I breathed in the familiar scent of her shampoo, the same brand she'd used since high school, a small consistency in a world that had become entirely unpredictable. "How are you holding up, Mom?" she asked, her voice gentle with the kind of concern adult children show when they realize their parents are mortal, vulnerable, capable of being broken. How was I holding up? How do you tell your daughter that her father had another family, another wife, another daughter who looked just like her? How do you explain that the man she'd idolized had spent her entire life living a lie so elaborate it made my head spin just thinking about it? "I'm managing," I said, which was true in the most technical sense. I was managing to breathe, to walk, to perform the basic functions required to get through each moment. Whether that constituted holding up was debatable. The church was fuller than I'd expected. Harold had been well liked in our community, known for his generosity and his willingness to help neighbors with everything from car troubles to financial advice. He'd served on the church board, coached Little League, organized charity drives with the kind of efficient enthusiasm that made things happen. If only they knew, I thought as I walked down the aisle to my place in the front pew, Sarah's arm linked through mine for support. If only they knew how good he was at managing multiple lives simultaneously. I spotted Elena immediately, sitting in the last row on the right side, wearing a navy blue dress that looked expensive but understated. She'd chosen perfectly, nothing that would draw attention, nothing that would seem inappropriate for a colleague paying respects. She looked like exactly what we'd agreed she was. A work acquaintance who'd known Harold professionally. But I could see the grief in her posture, the way she held herself carefully upright as if any relaxation might cause her to crumble. She was mourning as deeply as any of us, perhaps more so because her grief had to be hidden, performed in secret, shared with no one who could truly understand. The service began with Amazing Grace, Harold's favorite hymn. I tried to sing along, my voice joining the congregations in words I'd sung hundreds of times before, but my throat closed on the lyrics about being lost and found. Who was lost? I wondered as the familiar melody washed over me. Harold living his double life? Elena and me discovering we'd shared a husband? Or all of us, stumbling through a love story built on foundations that turned out to be sand? Pastor Williams delivered a beautiful eulogy, speaking about Harold's devotion to family, his integrity in business, his commitment to his community. Every word was carefully chosen, respectful, honoring a man who'd touched many lives in positive ways. Every word was true and every word was a lie, depending on which life you were considering. Devoted to family. Yes, to two families with equal passion and commitment. Integrity in business. If you considered deception a form of business requiring exceptional organizational skills. Commitment to community. To two communities in two different states, neither knowing the other existed. I felt like I was watching someone else's funeral, listening to a eulogy for a man I'd never met. The Harold being described was both my husband and a stranger, both the man I'd loved and someone I'd never known at all. That's when Michael stood up to speak. My son walked to the podium with Harold's confident stride, carrying his father's features in his own face with such precision it made my chest tight. He unfolded a piece of paper with hands that shook slightly, the same way Harold's hands had shaken when he was nervous about speaking in public, and looked out at the congregation with his father's blue eyes. "My father," Michael began, his voice carrying clearly through the sanctuary despite the emotion that thickened his words, was the kind of man who never forgot what mattered most. "Oh, Michael, if only you knew how complicated what mattered most had become. He taught me that family comes first, always. That your word is your bond. That love isn't just a feeling, it's a choice you make every day, a commitment you honor even when it's difficult." I glanced back at Elena and saw tears streaming down her face, her composure finally cracking as she listened to words that could have been spoken by her own son about the same man. The same lessons, the same values, passed down to children who didn't know they shared a father. What would Harold think, I wondered with a mixture of grief and anger, if he could see both of his families in the same room, mourning him together without knowing they were mourning together. Michael continued, his voice growing stronger as he found his rhythm. "Dad always said that the measure of a man isn't in what he accomplishes for himself, but in how he treats the people he loves. By that measure, my father was the greatest man I've ever known. How he treats the people he loves. Harold had loved us all, Elena, me, all four of our children. He'd treated us with kindness, with attention, with the kind of devotion that most people only dream of receiving. The fact that he'd spread that love across two families didn't make it less real. It made it more complicated than any of us had known how to handle. He told me once," Michael said, his voice beginning to break with emotion, "that the hardest part of loving someone is knowing you can't protect them from everything. You can't shield them from loss, from pain, from the truth that life is fragile and sometimes unfair." The truth. Something inside me snapped. The truth. Harold had protected us from the truth our entire marriage. He'd shielded us from the knowledge that love could be bigger and more complicated than we'd imagined. He'd kept us safe from the reality that he was capable of loving two women, two families, two complete lives with equal devotion and commitment. But protection based on lies isn't protection at all. It's just postponed pain, delayed reckoning, borrowed time that eventually comes due with interest. I stood up suddenly, my movement so abrupt that Sarah reached for my arm in alarm. The entire congregation turned to look at me, hundreds of eyes focused on the grieving widow who was apparently overcome by emotion. But I wasn't overcome. For the first time in days I was finally, completely clear about what needed to happen. Harold had been brave enough to love two women completely but not brave enough to tell the truth about it. He'd been capable of managing the logistics of two lives but not capable of facing the consequences of his choices. Someone had to tell the truth. Someone had to be brave enough to speak the words Harold never could. I looked back at Elena, sitting alone in her navy blue dress, mourning her husband at a funeral where she couldn't claim him, where her grief had to be hidden and her love had to be secret. I looked at my children, praising a father they'd never truly known, honoring a man whose life had been far more complex than they'd ever imagined. I looked at the congregation full of people who'd loved Harold for his honesty and integrity, for his commitment to family and community, for values he'd actually lived by, just in ways none of us had understood. Enough. There's something you all need to know, I said, my voice cutting through the hushed sanctuary like a blade through silk. The silence that followed my words was absolute, profound, the kind of quiet that seems to press against your eardrums and make the air itself feel thick and heavy. Even the rustle of programs stopped, the quiet crying ceased, the subtle movements that accompanied any gathering of people came to a complete halt. 400 people held their breath as one, waiting for the grieving widow to speak words that would either explain her outburst or confirm their growing suspicion that grief had finally broken her mind. I could feel Sarah's hand on my arm, her fingers digging into my black dress sleeve with increasing urgency as she tried to pull me back down to the pew. I could hear Michael's confused whisper from the podium, asking if I was all right, if I needed a moment. I could sense the collective tension of friends and neighbors who'd come to pay their respects and found themselves witnessing something they couldn't name or understand. But I couldn't stop now. The truth had been trapped inside Harold's careful compartments for 38 years, locked away in separate calendars and secret phone calls and lies told with such conviction they'd become their own kind of reality. Someone had to let it out. Someone had to be brave enough to speak the words Harold never could. I looked directly at Elena, and she gave me the slightest nod, permission, understanding, the courage I needed to shatter the careful fiction we'd all been living. Harold was a good man, I said, my voice carrying to every corner of the sanctuary with a clarity that surprised even me. But he was also a complicated man. And our family is more complicated than any of you know. Sarah was tugging at my arm more insistently now, whispering urgently for me to sit down, her voice tight with embarrassment and concern. But I couldn't stop. The truth was bigger than embarrassment, more important than maintaining appearances, more necessary than protecting people from difficult realities. 43 years ago, I married Harold Garrison in this very church, I continued, looking out at faces that had grown increasingly concerned, increasingly confused. I thought I was his first and only wife. I thought our love story was unique, sacred and simple. The whispers started then, a low murmur rippling through the congregation like wind through wheat. I could see people leaning toward each other, exchanging glances that asked wordless questions about what was happening, whether someone should intervene, whether grief had finally pushed the widow past her breaking point. Yesterday at the funeral home, I learned that Harold had another wife. Another family. For 38 years he lived 2 complete lives, loving 2 women, raising 2 sets of children, building 2 homes with the same commitment and devotion he showed to all of us. The gasps were audible now, sharp intakes of breath that seemed to suck all the air from the room. I heard Sarah's strangled, "Mom, no," and Michael's confused, "What are you talking about?" from the podium. But I also heard something else. A collective recognition that what I was saying explained things that had never quite made sense, and answered questions that people had been too polite to ask. "Her name is Elena," I said, gesturing toward the back of the church where she sat frozen in her navy blue dress, her dignity intact despite the hundreds of eyes now focused on her. "She's here today mourning the same man we're mourning, loving the same man we loved. Her children, Miguel and Carmen, are Sarah and Michael's half-siblings." Elena stood slowly, and I saw in her posture the same determination that had driven me to my feet. She didn't speak, didn't try to defend or explain. She simply stood as a witness to the truth I was finally telling, as proof that Harold's life had been far larger and more complex than anyone had imagined. "I don't know how he managed it," I said, my voice beginning to shake, but not with grief, with something that felt like relief, like the dropping of a weight I'd been carrying without realizing it. "I don't know how he kept track of all the birthdays and anniversaries and school plays and soccer games. I don't know how he looked at us every day and didn't crack under the weight of loving so many people so completely. But I know he did love us all." "I'm angry," I admitted, the words flowing now like water from a dam that had finally burst. "I'm furious and heartbroken and confused. I feel betrayed and lied to and foolish for never seeing the signs that were probably right in front of me." The congregation was completely silent now, hanging on every word as if I were delivering a sermon they desperately needed to hear. "But I'm also amazed," I continued, surprising myself with the words as they came out of my mouth. "Because Harold didn't just have an affair. He didn't just cheat or lie for selfish reasons. He built 2 entire lives and he poured himself completely into both of them. He loved 2 women enough to sacrifice everything: financial security, peace of mind, the simple pleasure of living without secrets, to make sure we both felt cherished and protected. Michael had come down from the podium and was standing beside Sarah, both of them staring at me with expressions of shock, confusion, and growing understanding. Around the sanctuary, people were whispering more loudly now, processing what they'd heard, trying to reconcile the Harold they'd known with the man I was describing. "I'm not asking you to understand," I said, looking out at faces that ranged from sympathetic to scandalized to simply bewildered. "I don't understand it myself. But I'm asking you to remember that love isn't always simple. People aren't always simple. And maybe there's room in our hearts for a truth that's bigger and more complicated than the story we thought we knew." I sat down then, my legs suddenly too weak to hold me, my entire body trembling with the aftershock of what I'd just done. Sarah immediately wrapped her arms around me, and I could feel her shaking against my shoulder. I could hear her quiet sobs as she tried to process what she'd just learned about her father. "Mom," she whispered, her voice thick with tears and confusion. "Mom, how could he do this to us?" To us. But that was the question, wasn't it? Had Harold done this to us, or had he done it for us? Had he lied to hurt us or to protect us from a truth he thought we couldn't handle? Had he been selfish or selfless, cruel or kind? Maybe both. Maybe neither. Maybe the answer doesn't matter anymore. Pastor Williams, to his credit, managed to continue the service. He spoke about forgiveness and grace and the mysteries of the human heart with the kind of wisdom that comes from counseling families through their worst moments for over 3 decades. He didn't try to explain what couldn't be explained, didn't offer easy answers to impossible questions, didn't pretend that faith made complicated situations simple. After the burial, after the last handful of dirt had been thrown on Harold's casket, after most of the mourners had left with backward glances and whispered conversations, 6 people stood in the cemetery. Sarah, Michael, me, Elena, and 2 people I didn't recognize but who had Harold's unmistakable features. "Miguel and Carmen," Elena said quietly, introducing her children to us with a voice that carried decades of love and pride. "This is Margaret and these are Sarah and Michael. They're your half-siblings." Half-siblings. The word hung in the air between them like a bridge they weren't sure how to cross. Carmen stepped forward first, and I could see immediately what Elena had meant about the resemblance to Sarah. They could have been twins separated by 3 years. The same blonde hair, the same blue eyes, the same way of tilting their heads when thinking. "I've seen you at the hospital," Carmen said to Sarah, her voice soft with wonder and recognition. "We've probably worked the same shifts dozens of times without knowing." "Without knowing we were sisters," Sarah finished, and there was something like amazement in her voice. Miguel, quieter and more reserved like his father, extended his hand to Michael with formal politeness. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said. "For all of our losses. All of our losses. Because that's what we were now. Not 2 separate families mourning the same man, but one enormous, complicated family trying to figure out how to grieve together." "I don't know what happens now," Sarah said, speaking for all of us. "I don't know how we move forward from this, how we make sense of it all. Together," I said, the word coming out with more certainty than I felt. "We move forward together. All of us." Elena looked at me with something that might have been gratitude mixed with disbelief. "You would do that? After everything? What's the alternative?" I asked. "We can let anger and betrayal tear apart what's left of our families, or we can try to build something new from the pieces Harold left behind. Something Harold never could have imagined but maybe would have wanted if he'd been brave enough to dream it." Over the following weeks, we began the complicated process of untangling Harold's double life. There were lawyers to consult, insurance policies to sort through, assets to divide fairly between 2 wives who'd never known the other existed. There were awkward conversations with bank managers and doctors' offices and anyone who'd known Harold in either of his lives. But there were also Sunday dinners where all 6 of us gathered around Elena's dining room table, sharing stories about the man we'd all loved, piecing together a complete picture of who Harold had really been. There were grandchildren, Sarah's twin boys and Carmen's newborn daughter, who would grow up knowing they had a larger, more complicated family than most. There were moments of anger and confusion and grief that seemed too large for any of us to carry alone. But there were also moments of laughter, of recognition, of the strange comfort that comes from realizing you're not the only one trying to make sense of the impossible. Harold had created an enormous, complicated, unprecedented family. 2 wives who could be friends. 4 children who could be siblings. Grandchildren who would never lack for people who loved them. Elena and I grew closer than either of us had expected, bound together by shared experience and mutual understanding. We were the only two people in the world who'd loved Harold completely, who'd known him in all his complexity, who could speak his name without having to explain the complications that came with it. "Do you think he planned this?" Elena asked me one evening as we sat on her back porch, watching our grandchildren play in the yard that Harold had helped design. "Do you think he somehow knew we'd find each other, that we'd end up taking care of each other?" I considered this, watching Sarah and Carmen work together to push the little ones on swings, their movements synchronized in the way of people who share more than they ever knew. "I think Harold was many things," I said finally. "But a planner of this magnitude? Well, I think we're all just doing the best we can with what he left behind. But maybe the best we can is more than any of us expected. Maybe love really is bigger and more complicated and more resilient than we ever imagined." 6 months have passed since Harold's funeral, since the day I stood up in church and told a truth that changed everything. Elena and I have coffee every Tuesday morning now, sharing stories and comparing memories and slowly building a friendship based on something deeper than shared betrayal. Our children are planning a joint Christmas celebration this year, all of us together for the first time, creating new traditions from the ashes of old lies. It won't be simple and it won't be easy, but it will be honest in a way Harold never managed to achieve. I've learned that love isn't always enough, but sometimes it's more than enough. That families can be broken and rebuilt in shapes no one planned. That truth, however painful, creates space for healing that lies never could. Harold died taking his secrets with him, but he also died leaving behind something he never intended. Proof that love can survive almost anything, even the death of the person who taught us what love could be. If you've made it this far, thank you for walking this road with me. I hope this story gave you strength, or at least the feeling that you're not alone. Comment where you're watching from and maybe subscribe. Let's build a place where voices like mine, and maybe even yours, are finally heard.